Kitten's midnight adventure. The small gray tabby kitten crouched at the edge of the windowsill, her green eyes wide and unblinking in the darkness. Beyond the glass, the world was painted in shades of silver and black, the full moon hanging low and heavy over the sleeping village of Oakhaven. She pressed her nose against the cool pane, watching a moth dance in the glow of the garden lantern below. Her name was Pip, though she did not know this in the way humans understood names. She knew it as the sound that brought her food, the gentle call that summoned her from hiding places, the soft murmur that accompanied the hands that stroked her fur. She was barely 8 weeks old, small enough to fit in a teacup, with fur the color of storm clouds and eyes like new spring leaves. The house was quiet now. Her humans, the elderly Mrs. Chen and her granddaughter Lily, had gone to bed hours ago. Pip had spent the evening curled in her usual spot, the hollow of Mrs. Chen's neck, listening to the old woman's steady breathing and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. But something had woken her. A sound. A scent. A feeling that prickled along her spine and made her whiskers twitch. She slipped from the bed with the silence that only cats possess, her tiny paws making no sound on the wooden floor. The bedroom door was cracked open, just wide enough for a kitten to squeeze through. She descended the stairs one careful step at a time, her claws catching on the worn carpet. The grandfather clock chimed midnight as she reached the bottom, its deep bell sending vibrations through her chest. The front door was the problem. It was heavy and solid, with a handle she could not possibly reach. But the kitchen window, the one Lily always forgot to latch, stood open just enough. Pip jumped onto the counter, then onto the windowsill, and slipped through the gap into the cool summer night. The grass was wet with dew, cold against her paws. She shook each foot in turn, then stepped forward into the garden. The world was enormous. The hedges that had seemed small from the window now loomed like ancient forests. The moon cast shadows that moved and shifted, and every rustle of leaves made her ears swivel. A breeze carried 1,000 smells to her nose, damp earth and night-blooming jasmine, the sharp tang of rosemary from Mrs. Chen's herb garden, and something else. Something wild. Something that made the fur along her back stand up. It was the smell of the woods beyond the village, dark and ancient and full of mystery. Pip had never been outside alone. Lily sometimes carried her into the garden during the day, letting her sniff at flowers and chase butterflies, but always with the reassuring warmth of human hands nearby. Now there were no hands. There was only the night, and the kitten, and the vast stretch of the unknown. She took another step, then another, her tail held high like a flag. She passed beneath the rose arbor, where the blossoms hung pale and ghostly in the moonlight. A beetle crossed her path, and she pounced on it with a ferocity that surprised even her, batting it gently between her paws until it escaped into the grass. The hunt had begun. Down the garden path she went, past Mrs. Chen's prize-winning petunias, past the birdbath where she had once watched a robin bathe, past the rickety fence that separated the garden from the lane. The gate was held shut by a loop of twine, but Pip was small enough to slip through the gap beneath it. The lane was empty, lined with cottages whose windows were dark and curtained. The cobblestones were cold and rough, and Pip kept to the grassy verge where her paws found softer ground. A cat's silhouette moved across a rooftop, too distant to make out clearly, and she wondered if she would ever climb so high. She followed the lane toward the village green, where the ancient oak tree spread its branches like a canopy over the grass. In daylight, this place was full of children and dogs and people sitting on benches. Now it was deserted, a silent amphitheater under the stars. Pip crossed the green at a trot, her confidence growing with every step. Under the oak tree, she discovered something wonderful. A football had been left behind, forgotten by some child in the evening's last game. It was almost as big as she was, and it smelled of grass and rubber and human hands. Pip approached it cautiously, her belly low to the ground, her tail twitching. She reached out one paw and touched it. The ball rolled slightly, and she sprang backward, startled. Then she crept forward again, and this time she gave it a proper swat. The ball rolled across the grass, and Pip chased it, pouncing and batting until she was breathless and happy. For a few minutes, she forgot that she was lost. She forgot that she was alone. There was only the ball and the joy of the chase. But when the ball finally rolled to a stop against the trunk of a chestnut tree, the reality of her situation returned. She was far from home now, and she had no idea how to get back. A sound made her freeze. It was a low, rumbling growl, coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond the chestnut tree. Pip's ears flattened against her head, and her tail puffed to twice its normal size. She crouched low, making herself as small as possible, and watched. A shape emerged from the shadows. It was a dog, a large one, with shaggy fur and eyes that caught the moonlight like pale coins. It was the shepherd from the farm at the edge of the village, a creature Pip had seen from the safety of Lily's arms but never confronted on her own. The dog sniffed the air, snorted, and took a step toward her. Pip did not think. She ran. She bolted across the green, her tiny legs moving faster than they had ever moved before, her heart pounding against her ribs. Behind her, the dog barked once, a deep and terrible sound, and gave chase. She ducked through a gap in a hedge, scratching her nose on a thorn but not slowing down. The hedge was too small for the dog to follow, and she heard him barking in frustration on the other side. She kept running, through a flower bed and across a garden and under a wooden bench, until the barking faded into the distance and she was alone again, panting and trembling in the dark. She had ended up in a part of the village she did not recognize. The cottages here were older, with thatched roofs and crooked chimneys. A narrow alley opened between two of them, and Pip crept into it, seeking shelter. The alley led to a small courtyard where a fountain stood dry and silent. A cat sat on the edge of the fountain, watching her with yellow eyes. This cat was older and larger than Pip, a Tom with torn ears and a scar across his nose. His fur was the color of rust, patchy and thin in places. He looked at Pip with the weary expression of someone who had seen too many nights. "So you're the one who woke the shepherd," he said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. Pip did not understand his words, but she understood his tone. She flattened herself to the ground, her ears back, her eyes wide. The Tom jumped down from the fountain and approached her. He sniffed her from head to tail, his whiskers brushing her fur. "You're just a baby," he said, his tone softening. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" Pip let out a tiny mew, the sound so small and pitiful that even the hardened Tom seemed moved by it. "Lost, are you?" He sat down and began to wash his paw, seemingly unconcerned. "This is the hour of the cat, little one. The time between midnight and dawn, when our world comes alive. You chose quite a night for your first adventure." He introduced himself as Barnaby, and he had been astray for as long as he could remember. He had been born in a barn on the far side of Oakhaven, one of a litter of 5, but he had been the only one to survive the winter that claimed his mother. He had learned to hunt in the snowy fields, to find warmth in haystacks and under porches, to avoid the traps and poisons that humans set for creatures they did not understand. He had been a kitten once, too, long ago. And now he was old, and scarred, and alone, but he was still alive, and that counted for something. He knew every alley, every garden, every warm spot in Oakhaven. He had survived dogs and cars and harsh winters, and he carried his wisdom in the scars on his body. He told Pip about the other cats of the night, about the White Queen who ruled the fish market and the Ginger Rogue who hunted the mill pond. He told her about the badgers who dug beneath the old chapel and the foxes who raided the dustbins behind the inn. "You cannot go home by the way you came," Barnaby said. "The shepherd patrols the green until dawn. But there is another way." He flicked his tail and began to walk, and Pip followed him without question. They moved through a network of passageways that only a cat would know. Through gaps in fences, across garden walls, under porches, and through hedges. Barnaby moved with practiced ease, and Pip scrambled to keep up, her short legs working double time. Once she got stuck under a low gate, her belly scraping the ground, and Barnaby had to come back and show her how to roll onto her side and wriggle through. "You'll learn," he said. "Every cat learns." They passed a compost heap where a family of hedgehogs was foraging, snuffling, and grunting as they turned over vegetable peelings. Pip had never seen a hedgehog before, and she stared at the spiky creatures with wonder. One of them looked up at her with bright black eyes, deemed her no threat, and returned to its meal. "Friends of yours?" Pip asked. "Tolerated neighbors," Barnaby said. "They eat the slugs. We leave them alone." They passed a greenhouse where a tabby cat with a white bib sat watching them from inside. Her name was Clementine, and she was a house cat who was allowed to roam at night. She and Barnaby touched noses through the glass before she turned and trotted back to her own domain. They emerged behind the bakery, where the smell of bread still lingered in the air. Barnaby paused to sniff at a discarded wrapper, then continued on. They passed the forge, the blacksmith's anvil gleaming in the moonlight. They circled the old church, where the gravestones stood like silent sentinels. Pip shivered as they passed the graves, sensing something solemn in the air. "Are there ghosts?" she mewed. "Perhaps," Barnaby said. "But they are the least of our worries tonight." Barnaby led her to the village pond, where the water was black and still, reflecting the stars like a mirror turned upside down. A family of ducks slept on a small island in the center, their heads tucked under their wings. Barnaby crouched at the water's edge and waited. Pip crouched beside him, not knowing what they were waiting for. Minutes passed. Then, with a sudden splash, a fish leaped from the water, arcing silver in the moonlight before disappearing again. Pip gasped and nearly fell into the pond. "The big ones come close to the edge after midnight," Barnaby said. "I caught one once, last winter, when the pond froze and they came up to breathe at the holes in the ice. Biggest meal I ever had." They moved on, passing the mill where the great wooden wheel stood silent, its paddles dripping in the darkness. The miller's cat, a plump calico named Marmalade, sat on the windowsill and blinked sleepily at them as they passed. A barn owl swooped low over their heads, its white wings glowing in the moonlight, and Pip ducked instinctively, though the owl was hunting mice, not kittens. They circled the churchyard, where the gravestones leaned at crooked angles, their inscriptions worn smooth by centuries of rain and wind. A fox slipped between the graves, carrying something in its mouth, and vanished into the hedgerow on the far side. Pip watched it go, her heart racing. The foxes and we have an understanding, Barnaby said. We hunt different prey. They do not trouble me, and I do not trouble them. But a kitten alone might be another matter. Stay close. They came to a wall, high and covered in ivy. Beyond it, Pip could hear the murmur of voices. She looked at Barnaby, who nodded toward the wall. Go on. Look. Pip climbed the ivy, her claws finding purchase in the thick vines. She pulled herself up until she could see over the wall. On the other side was a garden, larger and more beautiful than any she had ever seen. Flowers bloomed in every color, their petals silver in the moonlight. Roses climbed trellises along the stone walls. Lavender bordered the pathways, releasing its sweet scent into the cool air. A pond reflected the stars, and fireflies danced above the water like living jewels. A weeping willow stood at the far end, its branches trailing in the water like a cascade of green tears. And in the center of the garden, sitting on a stone bench beside the pond, was a girl. Barnaby did not follow her up the wall. Some places are for humans and their kittens, he said softly. I will wait for you here. And he settled into the shadows beneath the ivy, a patient sentinel. She was perhaps 10 years old, with dark hair that fell past her shoulders and a face that was both sad and hopeful. She was looking up at the moon, and there were tears on her cheeks. Pip's heart ached. She did not know why the girl was crying, but she felt an overwhelming urge to comfort her. She dropped down from the wall and crept toward the bench, her paws silent on the grass. The girl noticed her when she was only a few feet away. Her eyes widened. Oh, she breathed. Where did you come from? Pip mewed and walked closer. She jumped up onto the bench and sat beside the girl, pressing her small body against the girl's leg. The girl's hand came down and stroked her fur, and Pip began to purr. My name is Mira, the girl whispered. I was just thinking about my grandmother. She passed away last spring. This was her garden. She looked around at the flowers, the pond, the fireflies. I come here when I miss her. It makes me feel closer to her somehow. Pip purred louder and rubbed her head against Myra's hand. She did not understand death, but she understood sorrow. She understood the need for warmth and comfort. They sat together for a long time, the girl and the kitten, under the moon and the stars. Mira talked about her grandmother, about the stories she used to tell and the cookies she used to bake and the way she used to hum while she gardened. She pointed out the flowers her grandmother had planted, naming each one as if introducing old friends. The roses were Rosalind and Beatrice. The lavender was simply lavender, because her grandmother said it needed no other name. The weeping willow was Willow, and Mira had been climbing its branches since she was 4 years old. Do you think she can see me? Mira asked, looking up at the stars. Do you think she knows I'm here, taking care of her garden? Pip blinked slowly, the way cats do when they are content. She did not know about heaven or spirits or the afterlife. She knew only that the girl was sad, and that warmth and presence could ease sadness. She pressed her head harder against Myra's hand and purred louder. Mira smiled through her tears. I think she would have liked you. Eventually, Myra's father came to the garden gate. Mira? It's late. Time to come in. Mira scooped Pip into her arms. Look, Papa. I found a kitten. Her father came closer and examined Pip in the moonlight. She looks well fed. She must belong to someone. She has a collar, Mira said, finding the thin strip of leather around Pip's neck. There was a small tag. It says Pip, and there's a phone number. Pip did not understand what was happening, but she felt safe in Myra's arms. She had found a human, and humans meant food and warmth and home, even if this home was not hers. Myra's father dialed the number on the tag. Through the window of the cottage, Pip heard a distant voice answer, heard Myra's father explain, heard the relief and gratitude in the reply. She lives on the other side of the village. Her family is very worried. Mrs. Chen is an old friend of my mother's, actually. I'll return her now. Mira carried Pip through the village, past the green and the oak tree and the shepherd's territory. She held Pip close, and Pip felt the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, a comforting drumbeat against her ear. When they reached Mrs. Chen's cottage, the front door flew open before they could knock. Lily stood there, her face streaked with tears. "Pip," she cried, and took the kitten into her arms. Mrs. Chen stood behind her, looking pale but relieved. "She was in my mother's garden," Mira explained. "The cottage with the pond and the fireflies. She seems to like it there." Lily hugged Pip so tightly that the kitten squirmed. "I thought I'd lost you forever. Don't ever do that again." Mrs. Chen invited Mira and her father in for tea, and the two families discovered that they had much in common. Mrs. Chen had known Myra's grandmother when they were both young women, and they spent an hour sharing memories and looking at old photographs. Pip, meanwhile, was given a bowl of warm milk and a saucer of chopped chicken, which she devoured with the enthusiasm of a cat who had survived a great adventure. When she was full, she curled up in Lily's lap and began to wash her face, pausing every few seconds to yawn. She was sleepy now, so sleepy that her eyes kept closing on their own. But before she drifted off, she thought about the things she had seen. The moon and the shadows. The growl of the shepherd. The wisdom of Barnaby, the scarred old Tom. The girl with tears on her cheeks, and the garden full of fireflies. She thought about home, too. The soft bed and the warm hands and the sound of Lily's laughter. The grandfather clock and the smell of Mrs. Chen's cooking. The familiar corners and hiding places that she had taken for granted. The world was large and dangerous, she had learned. But it was also full of kindness. The dog had scared her, but Barnaby had guided her. The night had been cold, but Mira had held her warm. And now she was home, and the adventure was over, and she was safe. Lily carried her up to bed, and Pip curled into the hollow of Mrs. Chen's neck, just as she had done every night since she had come to live with them. The old woman's hand came up to stroke her fur, and Pip began to purr, a deep and steady rumble that filled the quiet room. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked its steady rhythm. The moon continued its slow journey across the sky. And somewhere out in the village, Barnaby was walking his nightly patrol, and Mira was dreaming of fireflies, and the world of the night continued its eternal dance. Pip closed her eyes and let sleep take her. She dreamed of the garden, the fireflies, the girl. She dreamed of chasing the football under the oak tree. She dreamed of the shepherd's growl, transformed into a bark of friendship. She dreamed of the long road home, and of the love that waited at the end of it. When she woke, it was morning. Sunlight streamed through the window, golden and warm. Lily was sitting on the edge of the bed, already dressed for school. "Good morning, sleepyhead," she said, and scratched behind Pip's ears. Pip stretched, her paws extending and her back arching. She yawned, showing her tiny pink tongue and needle-sharp teeth. Then she jumped off the bed and trotted to the door, her tail held high. The world was different in daylight. The shadows that had seemed so menacing were just flower pots and garden furniture. The hedge that had scratched her nose was a harmless row of boxwood. The lane that had seemed endless was just a short walk to the green. Mrs. Chen was in the kitchen, making tea. She put a saucer of milk on the floor for Pip, who lapped it up gratefully. Through the kitchen window, Pip could see the garden, the rose arbor, the bird bath. It all looked so ordinary, so safe. But Pip knew better now. She knew that when the sun went down and the moon rose high, the world transformed. The ordinary became extraordinary. The familiar became mysterious. And somewhere out there, perhaps, another kitten was crouched on another windowsill, gathering the courage for her own midnight adventure. Pip looked up at the window and saw her own reflection, a small gray tabby with green eyes. She blinked at herself, and her reflection blinked back. Tonight, she thought, she would sleep. But tomorrow night, or the night after that, or the night after that, she might venture out again. The world was too large and too wonderful to explore in a single night. There were gardens she had not seen, cats she had not met, adventures she had not yet imagined. She settled down in a patch of sunlight on the kitchen floor, curled into a tight ball, and went back to sleep. The night would come again. And when it did, she would be ready. Outside, the village of Oakhaven went about its business. The baker opened his shop. The children walked to school. The shepherd dozed in his kennel, dreaming of chasing cats through moonlit fields. And in a cottage on the edge of the village, a little girl with a flower garden woke up and smiled, remembering the kitten who had visited her in the night. The moon still hung in the pale morning sky, a ghost of its former self, waiting for the sun to set so it could once again cast its silver light over the world. And somewhere in the shadows, a scarred old Tom named Barnaby settled into his hiding spot beneath the church porch, closed his yellow eyes, and dreamed of the tiny gray kitten who had found her way home. The night had been long, and the adventure had been grand, and Pip had discovered something that would stay with her forever. She had discovered that even the smallest creature could be brave, that even the darkest night held beauty, and that home was not just a place, but a feeling, carried in the heart wherever you went. So ended the midnight adventure of a small gray kitten named Pip. But as every cat knows, one adventure always leads to another. That afternoon, a parcel arrived at Mrs. Chen's cottage. It was from Mira and her father, a thank you gift for bringing the two families together. Inside was a hand-painted ceramic bowl with a picture of a moon and a tiny cat, and a collar with a silver bell that chimed with every step. Lily put the new collar on Pip, and the kitten pranced around the kitchen, ringing with every movement. That evening, Mira came to visit. She and Lily sat in the garden while Pip chased moths between them, and by the time the sun set, the two girls had become fast friends. They made plans to explore the village together, to visit the pond garden, to share their secrets and their dreams. And when night fell once more over Oakhaven, Pip sat at the window, watching the moon rise. She was tired from her adventure, and her body was warm and full, and her humans were close by. But her green eyes still followed the path of a barn owl gliding across the silver sky, and her whiskers still twitched at the distant bark of the shepherd. Barnaby would be out there somewhere, she knew. Walking his patrol. Watching over the secret world of the night. And perhaps one night, when she was older and braver and wiser, she would join him for another journey. But for now, she was content. She closed her eyes and let the purr rise in her chest, a deep and steady hum that vibration through her whole body. The grandfather clock chimed 9. Mrs. Chen was knitting in her armchair. Lily was reading a book about cats of the world. Before bed, Pip made her rounds. She checked the kitchen, making sure no crumbs had been left behind. She inspected the living room, satisfied that the fire had burned down to embers. She visited the back door, pressing her nose against the crack, tasting the night air one last time. Then, satisfied that her domain was secure, she trotted up the stairs. Lily was already in bed, and Mrs. Chen was reading by lamplight. The old woman looked up as Pip entered, and smiled. "There you are, little explorer. Did you have a good day?" Pip jumped onto the bed, turned around 3 times, and settled against Mrs. Chen's hip. The old woman's hand found her fur, stroking gently, and Pip began to purr. Everything was as it should be. And when the next full moon rose over Oakhaven, casting its silver spell upon the sleeping village, a certain tiny tabby would be waiting at the windowsill, her green eyes bright with anticipation, ready to step once more into the magical, dangerous, wonderful world of the night.